Today we are absolutely delighted to have Neil Hamilton, Professor of Law and Director of the Drake Agricultural Law Center here presenting. He has some special guests that he will share with you, and I'm going to turn it over.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Judy, and I want to thank Judy and Gail, and hopefully this isn't too loud. It sounds like it's booming a little bit. And I want to thank everyone at the Des Moines Public Library for the opportunity and the invitation to be with you to talk about Cuba. And I want to thank all of you for coming and your interest in the subject. And of course, thank DuPont Pioneer also for supporting this series. It's also nice to see so many familiar faces and friends in the crowd. Let's talk a little bit about Cuba. Over the last 2 years, I've had the opportunity to travel to Cuba on 4 occasions. And in January of 2012, I took a delegation of the great law students and staff there for a week, studying agricultural law and agrarian reforms, and that are now underway in the country. And we also, of course, studied the people and the food, and I look forward to talking with you about all of that, and more importantly, answering the questions you might have about Cuba and about some of the things that are happening. This slideshow may have a life of its own, so if these just kind of keep going through, I may stop it every now and then. I also want to tell you, though, that I'm accompanied today by a special guest, Professor Martiza McCormack from the University of Havana Law School. She's visiting from the University of Havana Law School this week at Drake. And this is a historic visit. And I'll tell you why. And the fact that it's a historic visit in some ways kind of illustrates the difficult history of U.S.-Cuba relations, but also illustrates perhaps some of the path forward. Believe it or not, she is the very first law professor from Cuba to ever be approved by the U.S. government to travel to the United States in the last 50 years. And so we're very proud of the opportunity that Drake has to bring her here. And she's also accompanied by Emiliano Lerda. Emiliano is a student graduate of ours, an Argentinian, American, and our wonderful assistant on Latin American legal issues. And also have Matt Russell from the Agricultural Law Center, who many of you know from local food work, and Ed Cox, a staff attorney from. Well, my plan today is to talk a little bit about our trips, show some slides, and hopefully you're seeing some of these wonderful street scenes and pictures of Havana, and then talk to you about kind of the friendly and proud people that we met and that my students have met, and then offer some comments also about the changes that are underway in Cuba and what they may mean for Cuba, but perhaps more importantly, what they may mean for us as Americans. So how many of you have been to Cuba? Got a handful. Okay, well, half a dozen of you could be up here giving this the same talk then. And I know that if you've been, you probably have been sharing your insights and experiences with friends. How many of you would like to go to Cuba at some point? Okay, well, then we have quite a few more hands. And in many ways, that's kind of the situation I was in several years ago. You know, I've traveled a lot. Lectured and taught in 20-some countries around agricultural law. And of course, food and agriculture is something that all countries share, regardless of language or religion or political system. But the opportunity to travel to Cuba is an interesting one, and the students were looking for a place that we could travel. But also, as we'll talk about, there's some interesting things going on in Cuba in terms of agriculture and land reform and new and beginning farmers, some of the same issues that we've been working with in our center. And so that's part of why we were there. And the good news for people who are interested in traveling to Cuba is that it's become easier to travel. Not necessarily easy, because one of the unusual things about our relationship with Cuba, it's the only nation in the world that we as U.S. citizens need approval from our government to travel to. We could travel to North Korea if we could make it in without asking the government for permission. but to travel to Cuba, at least legally, as we have in our trips, you need permission in the form of a license from the U.S. government. That's changing, right? Our educational trips were made possible by an executive order that President Obama issued in January of 2011 that reestablished some of the opportunities for people-to-people travel and for educational trips. And so Drake, as an educational institution, is able to use our educational license and take delegations of students and faculty there. Others of you who've traveled to Cuba, perhaps gone with your church, the Des Arts Center went, various organizations have gone under a people-to-people license, which unfortunately those licenses have become more difficult to obtain from the Office of Foreign Asset Control. We've had an application in since October for Drake to be able to take delegations that wouldn't require people to be our students, but instead could focus around the subjects that we would be interested in. And who knows? One of these days I may get a letter from OFAC and they'll tell us we have a one-year license. Or I may not hear anything for another 4 or 5 months, right? We'll just have to see. But educational trips and opportunities to travel there are happening. So I want to ask you another question though, and that's the question I ask people when I talk to them about Cuba, is it's kind of the, what do we know about Cuba? How big do you think Cuba is? 100 miles long, 150 miles long, maybe 150? Too big? Right? It's 800 miles long from tip to tip, much bigger than we think about. And if you don't believe me, tonight when you go home and you look at the national weather map and you see Florida, and then you see this big kind of crescent across the top of the Caribbean, that's Cuba. And I think part of the problem is, and I'm sure if I would have been asked that question, I probably would have said 200 before I would say looked at it. But the point is that we we know very little about Cuba, at least as a general level, as Americans. You know, if we think about our minds being compartmentalized in some ways, our Cuba box is a pretty small box, right? I mean, there's a picture of Fidel with a cigar, and there's Che with his beret. There's the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and not a whole lot since, except maybe Elian Gonzalez, or the boat lift, or the Muriel boat lift, or kind of an unusual role that Miami politics seem to have whenever we have a presidential election, right? I mean, those are kind of, in some ways, the residue of our relationship with Cuba. But that's unfortunate because we have a much deeper shared history, and I think, hopefully, a different future. And so I want to focus on a couple issues, and I'm just going to roll through a few more of these slides. And you know, one of the fascinating things about traveling to Cuba, and many of you who've been there know this as well, even though it's only a 45-minute flight from Miami, it's like flying back several decades in time, both from a physical standpoint, but also in terms of many ways the structure of the economy and what you see on the streets. I've taken hundreds of pictures, and our students have taken hundreds of pictures, which we have in various files over at the center. But I'll talk just for a moment, because I realize you aren't agrarians or interested necessarily in agricultural law. But part of what's important to think about with Cuba, and this is an important period of change and movement for Cuba and its people. And I think Professor McCormack would verify this, and maybe give her the opportunity to, is that Cubans don't necessarily know exactly where it's headed, but they're optimistic. And more importantly, right, they're in many ways, right, committed to the success of their country. But a lot of the changes are being led around agriculture and food. Food in part because after the Soviet Union collapsed in '91 and disappeared, what they refer to as the special period, and you have to kind of put special in quotes, you know, 2/3 of their economy basically disappeared overnight. Subsidies of oil and other support. And so here was a nation that had to, in many ways, reinvent itself. Average adult lost somewhere between 50 and 20 pounds over the next several years. Blackouts for 16 hours a day in Havana in terms of availability of energy. And of course, a lot of people in the United States thought, well, this will be it. This is when, the revolution will fail or will fall, and whatever's going to come next that we hope comes next, though we haven't necessarily articulated that it's going to happen. But the Cubans persevered, and one of the ways that they had to was thinking about what they eat and where they grow it. And so a lot of you have seen the film Accidental Eden, or you've seen other films about Cuba with a lot of attention to urban agriculture and gardens and localizing the food system. And there's certainly a lot of that on the ground, and we studied a lot of that. And there are some lessons that we can draw from it. Though you can probably also take those lessons a little bit too far, because Cuba didn't necessarily go through that period by choice. It was forced on them by an emergency crisis. But I think they have learned a lot, and there are things we can learn from them. But what's going on now is an interesting process. Cuba found itself with, and this is hard for Iowans to believe, because you can't find very many acres of Iowa farm ground that isn't not just owned by somebody, it's being put to some use, something's being produced. But because of the communist structure of the country and the effect of the Second Agrarian Reform, in which most of the property had been taken back into state control, and then the sugar industry had collapsed or declined, and with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba had millions of acres of arable land that was basically sitting idle. And so, in some ways, it's almost a historical parallel to what we saw during or before the Homestead Act. They also had a large percent of their population on the state payroll and various forms of state jobs, an economy that was having difficulty both paying for those jobs, feeding its people, importing, and you can get any different set of numbers from government officials, but it's clear that they import somewhere between 60 and 80% of their food, historically, have a diet that isn't necessarily indigenous, lots of rice and beans and other foods that in some ways are an extension of the colonial sugar monoculture of the Spanish period, and a real need for agricultural production. And so one of the things that they've done, and Emiliano is finishing a thesis on this, and Professor McCormack is one of her nation's experts on this subject, is that they have entered into usufruct, basically long-term leases, with several 100,000 Cubans and families, granting them access back to arable land to become farmers or to make the land productive. And this began in 2008 as part of the reforms that the transition from Fidel to Raul created. Those usufruct contracts have been kind of modified. They're kind of doing it on the run. They've been extended in the size. They've been extended in length. People have been granted authority to build houses on these properties. Though if you ask them, they say, well, it sounds a lot like you're moving to a system of private property ownership. Oh, no, right? I mean, the property is owned by the state. There's an obligation of the state to make it productive, but people are being given access to it. And then there are a number of other things that have been happening along with that, such as creating more open markets, Some of the market scenes that you've seen. Kind of an unusual situation that in Cuba, in fact, one of the groups of people in their population who in fact have income or who have wealth, that during these difficult periods have not necessarily done well, but have done better, is that it's farmers who have been able to grow and sell excess food in the marketplace, such that when some of the other reforms I'm going to talk about relating to cars and real estate have rolled out, the agricultural sector and farmers are some of the people who are most able to, in fact, take advantage of it because of this. And as you might imagine, in an economy that is stretched for unemployment and income, and that in which people are looking for new enterprises and opportunities to be entrepreneurs, food and agriculture is something that is both close by, has a market, has a demand, and has relatively low barriers to entry, particularly when the land's provided to you and you're farming it using a very basic set of technologies. So, and then other things in terms of allowing sales from farmers to markets, sales from farmers into the tourism system, more availability of loans and bank loans from the state to individual farmers, and future reforms to come, because the Communist Party Congress in 2011 was was the first time they'd met since '96, issued a new set of guidelines, and those guidelines involve really are what a number of future reforms, such as expansion of what we would think about as a wholesale sector, co-ops of co-ops, and right, I won't bore you with more of the legal details. But there's a lot going on in the countryside. And back to this whole issue of what's happening in Cuba and how it's affecting the lives of the Cuban people in the last few years. Increased number of private businesses, not just the use of our contracts in agriculture, but an expanded list of business and entrepreneurial activities. And so when you walk down the street in Havana or any town, everybody's selling something in their front yard or out of their window or cooking something or doing some type of enterprise. And so, right, this real kind of energy around creating more of what would look like a private economy, with the blessing of the government, which in their system is important, in part because the government likes the idea of people having their own enterprises as opposed to being state employees, and it creates economic activity that can be taxed because the government has a significant need for revenue to be able to fund the things that Cuba does. And that's important for Americans to remember too, right? We might look at the Cuban process and look at buildings that haven't been repaired or people that are have an income of $30 a month and think, well, how does this work? But there are things that do work. Access to education, access to health care, right, and other services. And so in many ways, the Cuban people, and I think we have to value their view, is that this revolution has succeeded in some ways. But there are other things, right, that create the opportunity for future improvements. And that's in part what they're going through. This creating of additional businesses is one. The issue of land reform that I mentioned. The idea that Cuba has put back 3+ million acres of land into these agreements with a couple 100,000 Cubans, many of them young Cubans. Because this slide, one of the interesting things about going to Cuba was thinking about some of the parallels you see between the Cuban situation and our situation. Right? We think, there can't be a whole lot of equivalency between our experience in the United States and theirs. Well, legally, they came to agricultural law at about the same time. Martiza has been teaching for almost 30 years. Later this month, we're going to celebrate the 30th anniversary of my center at Drake. There's an aging farm population because many of the people that fought with Fidel and in the revolution who received land given to them under the first agrarian reform in '61, those people are now in their 70s or 80s, much like our old aging farm population, but also much like our farm experience. Certainly I'm a product of it in the 60s, Matt in some ways in the 70s. Kids who grew up on farms were in some ways kind of the ultimate harvest of agriculture because we went away to college and university to have other careers. And there are a lot of Cubans that raised their children in the 60s and 70s with the idea they were going to come back and be essentially what to us would look like peasant farmers. They're the doctors and lawyers and other people. In fact, many of them may have moved out of the country. But what you have is this aging farm population, an increased need for agriculture, and not just to replace the farmers who are on the land, much of which, or at least a portion of which, is privately owned because it was allocated in the first agrarian revolution, or the first agrarian reform. And so there's a parallel. At the same time, a growing interest in becoming farmers on the part of this non-farm population. Because a lot of these 200,000 people aren't necessarily farm kids who are going back, These are people who aren't necessarily agrarians, but who see it as an opportunity for enterprise and all the things that, in fact, brought people to agriculture in the history of our country. And agriculture is a form of wealth creation, which, of course, our state knows as well as anybody. And then a significant emphasis on expanding opportunities in local production and marketing, of course, which you also see. And at Drake, we're proud to be the sponsors of the Buy Fresh, Buy Local program for Greater Des Moines. Well, there are other things that are happening, and I don't necessarily have slides that are key to these points, but you've probably all read about these. One was the new rules to allow for the ownership and the marketing of automobiles, right? And which give you the opportunity for more personal freedom. the rules that allowed for a change in both the ownership and the marketing of real estate and of houses, bringing it out of the shadows. And another way of thinking about that is, I mean, it's not like that rule created any additional housing units, but if you think about if all of the houses you lived in were owned by somebody else, and you had the right to be there, but you didn't necessarily own it, it would change your willingness to invest in it, to improve it, right? But if in fact I then said, you know what, you do own your house, well now you've got a significant piece of wealth, which you may be able to use as collateral to borrow against it. You have a different set of expectations in terms of your willingness to invest in it, to improve it, maybe to buy a better house, right? Maybe to have the money that my relatives are shipping me from abroad to acquire a different house. And it also has the effect of then helping drive changes in the economy. Because if you have more people willing to remodel and improve their houses, you create demand for people to be in that business, right? As long as they can have access to the materials to do it with, right? Which we're going to come to in a moment. So that's an important issue. And in January of this year, in fact, January 14th when we were there, another new rule went into place which liberalized the ability of Cubans to travel abroad without the approval of the Cuban government. You can obtain a visa from a foreign country, you can buy a ticket, you can go. You don't have to have permission from the government, with a limited number of exceptions for people that are either in a situation where they're a national resource or have access to information. And I can tell you when we were there that that was a day when everybody who's on the street or that we talked to mentioned it, right? Because it was important to them. And I have to say that to you or I, these may seem like fairly minor or commonplace things. Owning a car, having a house, being able to travel, right, without getting the government approval. But to the Cuban people, they are very significant, right? And they deal with things where people live, right? In the sense of what you eat, where you live, your ability to travel, right? Your ability to look for a different enterprise. And so all of these are contributing, I think, to a new sense of optimism and opportunity. And of course, there are aspects of Cuba that we recognize, and there are some slides in here that deal with issues of access to land and the role of legal systems, like the law school, access to safe food in the marketplace, and they still have the ration card, but they're limiting it. Well, at the same time, Cuba is facing some other changes in its future. One that you read about is a leadership transition, right? A transition from Fidel Castro to Raul, and now, right, Raul was reelected last month, but it's going to be his last term, a 5-year term. I've identified a new vice president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, right? And what's exciting about this isn't another 80-year-old, right, who was in Barbuda, who was in the mountains, right, as part of the revolution, but instead this is a new post-revolutionary generation of leadership, which is, if nothing else, historic. At least from the American standpoint, maybe another one of those markers in time that says, well, so why exactly do we still have the embargo that we imposed in 1962 that grew out of the Cold War dynamic of the Soviet Union? It disappeared 20 years ago. Communism in many ways has disappeared, and even in the Cuban situation is being, in some ways, right, reformed. Certainly, our understanding of communism has been reformed by our dealings with China, which we have to remind ourselves every now and then that is a communist country in some way. And so, right, part of this is, the whole issue of what's next. And I don't think there's any reason to believe that Cubans aren't committed to the revolution and to a Cuban future. But they'll shape that future in terms of what it means for this refinement of the socialist experiment. Because when you tell them about, well, this is an interesting set of economic reforms that you're going through, they won't necessarily see it then, right? Well, we're making changes, but right, we're dealing with, right, our situation going forward. There's also some uncertainty, and certainly one of the things is the death of Hugo Chavez. and this relationship that Venezuela has with Cuba, and the significant amount of economic subsidization that Venezuela is providing to Cuba. In many ways, Cuba traded the former Soviet Union, which disappeared, with someone else playing in somewhat the same role that was this kind of external, in some ways artificial support of their economy based around the ideology of their leadership. And the death of Chavez and the transition in Venezuela at least raises some important questions for Cuba, and in fact probably puts additional emphasis on the need for them to move forward. Well, and so to close, the reality is the Cuban economy is relatively fragile. I think it's safe to say. There are limited natural resources, at least the exploitable type. Haven't been able to find oil supplies, right? The wells on the north side in the ocean haven't proved out yet. And so as a result, right, a lot of the capital is human capital. And in fact, part of Venezuela's justification for the support for Cuba are the tens of thousands of doctors that Cuba provides to Venezuela and to other countries around the world, which are a product of their educational system. But the reality is that the political dynamics, right, Cuban government's approach, the relationship with the United States, which has been in some ways tortured and fractured over the last 50 years, and when we do have an embargo in place, which, right, has certainly hampered the growth and investment in Cuba, certainly American companies' involvement there, these are things that make the way forward at least difficult and present opportunities for doing things differently. This is in part why tourism is so important to the country, because tourism is one of the very bright spots that Cuba sees. It also threatens the country in some ways. Any of you saw Accidental Eden, the National Geographic documentary shows that as well. Well, Cuba raises lots of questions for us to consider. What's Cuba need from the United States? Other than maybe be left alone for a little while. What's the future of Cuba's economy and its political reforms? What will the United States do with the embargo after 50 years? What's going to be that trip point that'll lead to us somehow making a reform in it? But those are the type of questions that I hope you have, and so this is an opportunity for audience participation. And I'm happy to answer some questions. If you have questions for Martiza, Emiliano can help translate as well. I didn't, invite her here to take part in this speech. We had this established before we knew for sure that she was going to get her visa approved. But it's a wonderful kind of coincidence of our timing, and this is a great opportunity for kind of what we're calling Cuba Week at Drake. So you'll come down and do this public talk as well. So thank you. And I'll repeat the question maybe if we need to somehow record it for posterity or people can't hear you. Yes?
What do you know about the status of the embargo? Is something happening?
Oh, the question is what do you know about the status of the embargo? And I think any of us probably only know what we read in the paper. A political decision on the part of the U.S. to change the embargo is freighted with a lot of political questions, right? And it's not just the issue of the Miami Cuban community, people that still believe and are bitter about what happened in their country and the loss of their property. There are a lot of political issues involved with it. If I was President Obama, which I'm not, but I guess none of the rest of you are either. But just like Nixon went to China, I think there's an opportunity for the president to reach out and go to Cuba and to actually change things by the end of his administration. Now, in the great scheme of things, Cuba's not that important of an issue for the United States, right? I mean, in the sense of, they're not a threat to us, right, militarily. It's more of an opportunity, and it's a chance to, in some ways, address or redress or to, move forward. Because we do have, just a little bit of of a historical note, because this fits into the category of what we don't know about Cuba. We all know about the Spanish-American War, right? And remember the Maine and Teddy Roosevelt, and we don't necessarily think about the Spanish-American War as a great colonial period of America's history, right, in which we obtained Guam and the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Cuba. But the Cubans see the Spanish-American War much differently, right? This was the Cuban Revolution against Spain. They'd been fighting for independence from Spain, modeled after the United States' revolution. The United States entered the war, settled a peace with Spain without Cuba being even at the table. And as the Cubans would say, Spain basically sold Cuba to the United States and got out, and then we took over, right? And in fact, we had, right, the Platt Amendment in our law that gave us an unlimited right to intervene in Cuba anytime we needed to. And we did, right? And in fact, it was from that period, you might know, when you hear about Guantanamo, every now and then you might think, well, how is it again that we have a military base on Cuba, right? Well, it's from that period, right? It was one of a series of bases that we established around the world. And if you were the Cubans, their idea might be, well, yeah, give us back Guantanamo, and then we can talk about our relationship. And if that's part of going forward, well, okay, then we trip over that one, right? But, so next question. Yes, sir, ma'am, down front. What's your question?
Did you say that Venezuela, now that Hugo Chavez is dead, they are not giving?
No, I didn't say that. They haven't changed their policy, and in fact, the new president, right, the vice president become the president, is Chavez or Chavian or whatever, and probably has the same right view. The Cubans certainly hope they do. But at the same time, he isn't Hugo Chavez, right? I mean, he didn't have the same relationship with the Castros. And Venezuela has its own issues. Right? I mean, if you're a political leader and you have poverty and other deep issues in your own country, then you have to figure out, well, how much money am I spending somewhere else? And exactly why am I doing that?
Yeah, I wondered how they even could afford to do what they did.
Well, they can afford to do it because it's primarily in the form of oil, right? And the way the subsidy in some ways works, and the Cubans would say it's not really a subsidy, but is that Venezuela provides Cuba a certain amount of oil every day. Cuba doesn't use most of it, sells much of it on the open market, and uses the money that's obtained from the oil revenues to, in fact, help pay for the operation of the government. But then there are other, I mean, it's not a pure market exchange because there are all these human, there are all these doctors, and there are other things that Venezuela is obtaining in the relationship. But it's a very unique relationship, and it was one that grew out of the personal connection between the leaders of the country, as well as the ideology of the country. I mean, there's a, I don't want to make it look, too just individual. I mean, there's a real national linkage between the countries. So, in the back, and then move down front here. Yes.
Are there visible signs of people living opulently?
Well, there are certainly, the question is, are there signs of people living opulently? And I don't think you've seen the division in classes like you do in China, right? And that's a tiger that China's going to have to figure out how it gets down off the back of by having billionaires at the same time you have hundreds of millions of poor peasants in the countryside. But there are certainly people in Cuba you see who are doing well. We saw more new cars. Every time I've been, you've seen visible changes in the culture. And part of the division in Cuba is who you work for, or oftentimes where and who are your relatives. Because people that have relatives outside the country can make remittances to Cuba. You or I can make remittances to Cuba. One of the liberalizations is that we could send any Cuban $200 or $2,500 if we can establish a remittance program to be able to do that. And relatives, right? So, and one of the things about people in Cuba, and Maritza's a good example, her father and two sisters and much of her family live in the United States. Some of whom, this is her first time ever to travel here, relatives she hasn't seen in 30 years, siblings she hasn't seen in 10. And even though the relatives in other countries may not be wealthy by our standards, by Cuban standards, they are. And if they're able to send money back to Cuba, or goods and supplies, which are in many ways driving the economy. One of the, Cuba's sent mixed messages because one of the changes they made last fall was they changed the tariff duties, and the taxes they were charging on people who were bringing stuff in. Because anybody's been on a plane flying to Cuba, and particularly out of Miami, because all the times I've gone, there are half a dozen direct flights a day out of Miami. People have this kind of mistaken idea that to get to Cuba you have to go to Canada or Mexico or somewhere else. Well, there are direct flights to Havana from Atlanta and Chicago and New York and Miami and other places. But the planes will be loaded with some of the damnedest stuff, right? I mean, you'll see people with motorcycles and stacks of tires and building materials and boxes of TVs and plumbing supplies. And so a lot of that is flowing into their economy, being brought in by people who can legally bring it in, right? Either Cubans that are traveling out of the country or relatives that are coming to visit, or visitors that are coming and have maybe been asked to bring things. And the Cuban government in some ways needs those things, the country needs them. They're also a potential form of revenue if you can tax them. But if you tax them too much, well then you kind of dry up how these materials are helping support this kind of embryonic business sector. Right here, I promise this lady.
I just got, did you get the feeling that, we were there in November, and I threw it to a company, and the first thing that happened when we arrived at Havana was a talk by
ICAP, the Institute for Friendship Among the Peoples.
I think he wasn't, he was where he might be now, but.
And you heard about the Cuban Five?
Oh my gosh, yes.
Okay.
It just seems like that is the biggest thing that bothers it the most about our country. We will not, if they would just, this young man said, he's a member, he has been a representative of the UN.
I'll fill you in all in on this, but anybody that's been to Cuba, if you go in through a people-to-people delegation, then one of the things you're going to be greeted with on the other end is a meeting with the Institute for Friendship Among the Peoples, ICAP, or whoever kind of the host organizations are. And part of that is an opportunity to have some of U.S.-Cuba history explained to you through the Cuban eyes, right? And which is interesting. I mean, I don't want to say you sprinkle a grain of salt on it, right? But it's okay, it's their view. But then these Cuban Five, right? Who most of us wouldn't know the Cuban Five. We think it's a ball team or something. But every Cuban child knows the name of all of them. These are 5 Cuban government agents who are arrested in the United States, imprisoned. 4 of them still. One's been on parole, but in parole in Miami. And it all goes back to the Brothers to the Rescue, right? And the U.S. attempts to try to, from the Cuban view, destabilize their country. From our view, bring democracy and opportunities there. These Cubans were reporting to their government on the operation of what they would describe, and I think we in any other circumstance would describe as terrorist organizations. They just happen to be our terrorists, right? There are people operating out of Miami who are carrying out terrorist activities in Cuba. But as the part of this, reporting process, then they were arrested, both as being foreign agents in the United States, but then also, there's 2 sides to it, because if you look up the Cuban Five here at home, there were these attempts to enter into Air Force bases, right? And we don't necessarily buy the story that they were as innocent as the Cubans had, right? But to many of the Cubans, they almost, just like giving back Guantanamo as a starting point, freeing the Cuban Five is another one. And that they were unfairly tried. And of course, anytime we have somebody tell us that we did something unfairly, our hackles go up. And that our legal system somehow, didn't give them a fair trial. And, their argument is, well, they were tried in Cuba, tried with a jury, or tried in Miami, tried with a jury of their peers, many of whom were, anti-Castro U.S. Cuban. And then it goes from there. But, so the Cuban Five, be prepared, and, it's, part of the process. And it's an interesting education.
Yeah, I think it's such a
well,
tragedy that we don't have relations with them because we're missing.
Well, there are 2 other things I want to mention on that. It's a tragedy we don't have relations. The U.S. says we don't have an embassy in Havana. Right? We have an interest section that's hosted by the Swiss. Well, You can go to the U.S. intersection, and the only thing Swiss in the whole building may be cheese in the cafeteria, right? Because it is the former U.S. embassy. And it, for all intents and purposes, is an embassy that can't be called one largely because of the political relationships that we don't have relationships with, right? The Swiss, because during the revolution, the government reclaimed property that had been abandoned. The Swiss moved into the U.S. ambassador's residence and used the U.S. embassy for storage of materials such that the country couldn't take it back. And so that's why we have this, right, 10-story embassy sitting down, right, on the ocean, right, not far from downtown Havana. And, but so we have in the U.S. intersection there, 70-some diplomats who are there. And so that's one thing. But the other thing to remember is, how many of you know who Alan Gross is? Well, see, Alan Gross is kind of our version of the Cuban Five, right? Alan Gross was this American who's been in prison in Cuba for several years. He was there working on the USAID project. He's in poor health, has cancer, right? We've made these pleas. There's people in Congress saying we won't do anything with Cubans until they release Alan Gross, right? Well, interesting. But if you look at what Alan Gross was actually charged with doing, right? He had a suitcase full of satellite phones, right? He had a whole series of other contraband equipment, which was paid for by the U.S. government through a USAID project, right? He was trying to establish independent communications opportunities for Cubans with, right, people in America, which is all fine, other than it's illegal, right? And that's in fact what he was arrested for and what he's in prison for. And so the idea that Alan Gross is, you know, this somebody on a tourist visit that was just kind of picked up off the street and is being held as a pawn, isn't quite the case. You know, Alan Gross probably has a bigger complaint with the U.S. government, right, in terms of the USAID project that he was part of. But we spend millions of dollars a year still supporting these, right, democracy activities in Cuba, which are basically, right, attempts to, well, then you can fill in the blanks, right? Ours would be, you know, to bring communications, to expand access to information, right, to promote human rights on the part of the Cuban people. And the Cubans say, it's basically America. You wouldn't tolerate us paying for people to do these activities in the United States. Why is it that we would tolerate you, right, trying to do this stuff here? And that maybe goes back to some extent the root of our relationship is, I think the Cubans would say, we'd like the United States to actually respect us. One, to, right, recognize that the revolution succeeded and that we don't have to give it up as a precondition for moving forward. And after that, we'll talk. And it's not clear that the United States, at least to this extent, has been willing to do it. So I think this president is probably closer to being willing to do it. And generationally, the change that you see happening in Florida and in the Cuban community, right? There are lots of people who would love to go back to their country, right? And would, you know, look for the opportunity to help Cubans have a better and brighter future, and weren't necessarily either burdened by the Cold War lens, which we may see things through, or necessarily by the, you know, what has to be a bitter personal history. You know, the Peter Pan movement, you know, when we helped evacuate 15,000 Cuban kids from 5 to 12 to the United States in the early 60s because of the fear that the communist government was going to take kids away from their parents, right? Catholic Church was involved in organizing this. We brought them here, everybody thinking they were going to go back and be reunited with their parents relatively soon. Very few, if any of them, have ever gone back, right? Because what was happening after the missile crisis in the Bay of Pigs that we thought was going to be over in a year or two, it's 50 years later. And if you want to read a book on that part of Cuba's history, read Carlos Erie's Waiting for Snow in Havana, or his second book, Waiting to Die in Miami. He's a writing professor now, but who was one of the Peter Pan kids, right? Never saw his father again. Was only reunited with his mother 4 or 5 years later when she was finally allowed to leave, right? And it's a very moving book, and so it makes you think that, you know, there are human emotions and histories on both sides of these. Maritza's family history is an interesting one from an earlier period, because her great-grandfather came to Cuba in 1897 with the Spanish-American War, and the Revolution came, fell in love with a Cuban girl, and stayed there, right? And so McCormack's from Boston, right, are Cubans from 100 years